The silence was the first sign that everything the prospectus had promised was a lie. From the command deck of the Omnigen prospecting vessel Stardust Drifter, Ethel was a jewel, a swirl of viridian green and sapphire blue that made the corporate analysts salivate in the ship's AI sing songs of projected profit. It was designated a silent world, a Class G planet teeming with complex organic signatures but broadcasting nothing, a galactic anomaly cordoned off by intersystem edict, not with threats, but with a simple, less chilling warning here. The universe holds its breath. Omnigen, however, had never been one for holding its breath. Not when thorium crystal deposits shimmered in the deep scan spectrographs like a promised land. They had bought the charters, bribed the regulators, and scrubbed the warnings from the official mission logs, replacing them with projections of unparalleled wealth. My job, as senior cartographer and resident xenogeologist, was not to question the why, but to map the how, to chart the veins of that shimmering promise and lay the groundwork for the strip miners and atmospheric processors that would follow in our wake. Yet I couldn't shake the unease that coiled in my gut like a cold serpent. For 3 rotations in high orbit, we had listened with every sensor we possessed, from the deep radar arrays to the hypersensitive neutrino detectors, and Ethel had offered only a profound, absolute stillness. A world-spanning jungle should have been a cacophony of life, a symphony of electromagnetic chatter from the planet's own magnetic field interacting with its star, the rustle and roar of 1 billion living things. Instead, there was nothing, a void on all frequencies that felt less like emptiness and more like a deliberate, enforced hush. The ship's captain, a corporate man named Valerius, whose jaw seemed permanently set in a sneer of ambitious impatience, saw it as a good omen. "No complications," he'd boomed over the comms earlier that morning, his voice dripping with condescension. No electromagnetic interference for the drones, no apex predators roaring on the comms to spook the ground team. It's a clean slate. Kalen, a blank check. I didn't remind him that nature is never a blank check. It is a debt that always comes due. The first excursion team, Exo Alpha, was a dozen of our best, clad in state-of-the-art environmental suits, their helmet cams broadcasting a feed of breathtaking, yet unnerving, beauty back to the drifter. They touched down in a clearing that seemed almost too perfect. A circle of alien, silver-bladed grass surrounded by trees whose bark swirled with bioluminescent patterns, pulsing in a slow, hypnotic rhythm. Every visual was stunning, a biologist's dream and a marketer's fantasy. But the audio feed was a dead hum, the sound of the suit's own life support systems, and nothing more. Not a bird, not an insect, not the whisper of wind through the canopy, even as their suit sensors registered a steady 10-knot breeze. It was a silent movie of a vibrant world. Commander Sergeant Eva Rostova, Alpha's leader, crackled over the comm, her voice tight with a professionalism that couldn't quite mask her own awe and apprehension. "The air composition is clean. Flora is passive. We're proceeding to the primary survey point, the crystalline outcrop designated Locus 1. From my console, I watched their biometric readouts, a string of calm, green numbers, heart rate steady, adrenaline levels low. Everything was perfect. Too perfect. I cross-referenced the deep scan topography with their live feed, and that's when I saw the second anomaly. The crystalline formations we had detected from orbit, the thorium we had come for, didn't match any known geological patterns. On the live feed, The outcrop at Locust 1 rose from the jungle floor, not like a jagged cluster of rock, but like a series of immense, gracefully curved ribs, a skeleton of crystal half buried in the soil, glowing with a soft, internal light. It looked less like a mineral deposit and more like the fossilized remains of some gargantuan, forgotten god. "Valerius," I said, patching a private channel to the captain's chair. "Look at this morphology. This isn't volcanic or sedimentary. It looks organic." He glanced at the screen, his lip curling. "It's alien, Kalen. That's why it's valuable. Just map it." The first sign of trouble came from Specialist Jax, the team's geologist. An hour into the survey, as he ran his own scanner over the surface of the crystal ribs, his voice came over the comm, hushed and strange. "It's humming," he whispered, though his suit's audio sensors picked up nothing. "Can't you hear it? It's singing." Rostova was on him in a second. "Jax, report your status. Are your suit systems malfunctioning?" There was a pause. And then Jax laughed. A high, unnerving sound that sent a ripple of alarm through my own nervous system. "No, Sergeant. The suit is fine. It's the rock. The stone. It's singing the song of the deep." His biometrics began to flicker, his heart rate spiking erratically. On the bridge of the drifter, a nervous silence fell. Valerius leaned forward, his smugness evaporating into a focused glare. "Rostova, what's his status?" "He's unresponsive, sir," she reported, her voice strained. Her camera feed swung around to show Jax. He had taken off his helmet. The air was breathable. Yes, but it was a catastrophic breach of protocol. His face was pale, his eyes wide and unfocused, fixed on the glowing crystal as if it were the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. A slow trickle of blood ran from his nose, stark and red against his white skin. He was smiling. "He's beautiful," Jax murmured, his voice now a faint whisper on the open comm, before Rostova's medic could tackle him and slap an emergency respirator over his face. "We shouldn't be here. We're interrupting the music." That was when the rest of Exo Alpha began to feel it. It came not as a sound, but as a pressure, a low-frequency vibration that resonated directly in the bones, in the fluid of the inner ear. Their biometrics started to dance, a chaotic chorus of rising heart rates and stress indicators. "Commander," Rostova said, her voice now dangerously unsteady. "We're all feeling it now, a severe pressure, disorientation, requesting immediate evac." Valerius's face was a mask of fury, his dream of a quick and easy score dissolving into a nightmare of mission failure. "Negative. Sergeant, secure your geologist and complete the primary survey. OmniGen did not spend 1 trillion credits for you to get spooked by a little alien tinnitus." But it was already too late. As he spoke, something began to happen on the surface of the crystalline outcrop. The faint, internal light within the massive ribs began to pulse, mirroring the frantic rhythm of the surveyor's heartbeats. Thin, crystalline filaments, like spun glass, started to grow from the surface of the rock, reaching out towards the team. They moved with a slow, deliberate, unnatural grace, weaving through the air like frost patterns forming on a window pane. "They're growing!" One of the surveyors screamed, the terror in his voice finally breaking through the disciplined comms chatter. "Gods, they're growing right out of the rock." The filaments touched another team member, and he went rigid, his rifle clattering to the ground. His suit stiffened, the clear faceplate clouding over with a rapidly spreading web of crystal. I watched in horror as the process repeated, the crystalline growth enveloping them one by one, sealing them inside shimmering, translucent cocoons. They didn't scream or fight. They just stood there, their faces either blank with shock or serene with a terrifying acceptance. Rostova was the last one. She backed away, firing her pulse rifle at the advancing crystal weave. The energy bolts sizzled and dissipated against the glowing surface with no effect. Her camera feed gave us a final, shaky view of the scene her entire team encased, standing like a gallery of macabre statues before a crystalline thread touched her helmet. The feed fizzled, distorted into a cascade of rainbow static, and then went black. The audio channel remained open for another 10 seconds, and in that time, we heard it. It wasn't a scream or static. It was music, a clear, complex, and deeply mournful harmony of choral voices, rising in a crescendo of heartbreaking beauty before the channel cut to absolute silence. For a full minute, the command deck of the Stardust Drifter was as quiet as the planet below. The spell was broken by Valerius slamming his fist on his console. "Planetary contamination," he roared, his face purple with rage and a sliver of fear. "A neurotoxin fungus, a silicon-based parasite, something. Get me a full analysis. I want to know what killed my team." But I knew it wasn't a fungus or a parasite. I was watching the ship's deep frequency sensors, and the subsonic hum I had noticed earlier, the one that emanated from the planet itself, had changed. It was no longer a steady, monotonous vibration. It was pulsing in the exact same melodic structure as the song we had heard from Rostova's comm. The planet itself was singing. And now, for the first time, I felt it too. A faint vibration at the base of my skull, a subtle pressure behind my eyes. Across the bridge, I saw others shifting uncomfortably, rubbing their temples. Navigator Chen looked pale, her eyes darting into the shadows of the cockpit. The silence of Ethel was a lie. The planet was broadcasting on a frequency we weren't equipped to understand, a signal that didn't travel through the air, but through the mind itself. Valerius, blinded by his corporate fury, refused to see it. "Launch the heavy drones," he commanded, "and prep Exo Bravo. Full combat gear this time. Whatever's down there, we're going to burn it out." "Captain, you can't," I pleaded, standing up from my console. "We don't know what we're dealing with. It's communicating. It's reacting to us. Sending another team down there is a death sentence." He turned on me, his eyes blazing with a cold fire. "Your job is to map the ground, Kalen, not to question my commands. Bravo team will deploy with containment gear and sterilizing charges. They will retrieve our people and secure that location. Is that clear?" It was clear he was going to get us all killed. As the second dropship, a heavy-duty combat lander, detached from our ventral bay and began its fiery descent into Ethel's atmosphere. The pressure in my head intensified. It was no longer a vague hum. It was a presence, a feeling of being watched by something impossibly vast and ancient. It felt like the gaze of a sleeping titan whose dream we had disturbed. Then came the whisper. It wasn't on the comms. It wasn't a sound heard with the ears. It bloomed simultaneously in the minds of every single person on the Stardust Drifter, a collective, silent thought that was not our own. The voice was neither male nor female, but a composite of 1,000 voices. The same harmony we had heard from the dying ground team now formed into a single, coherent, and utterly terrifying word that echoed in the deepest recesses of our consciousness. Enough. On the main view screen, the combat lander, which had just breached the upper cloud layer, stopped. Not slowed, not decelerated, but simply stopped, suspended in midair as if caught by an invisible hand. A faint, viridian light began to glow around its hull, a light that seemed to emanate not from the ship, but from the air itself. Then, with the silent, effortless grace of a predator, the planet squeezed. The dropship's hull crumpled inward, not from an external blast, but as if every molecule of its structure had been commanded to collapse upon itself. Metal folded like paper, reinforced armor plating buckled and tore, and the entire vessel imploded into a knotted, screaming ball of wreckage that fell from the sky like a stone, trailing a plume of smoke and frozen fuel. In our minds, the chorus of voices whispered again, no longer mournful, but filled with a cold, resonant power, a promise of what was to come. Now, you will listen. And in that moment, I knew. We hadn't come to a silent world to drill for thorium. We had stumbled into a cage, and we had just woken up the warden, the psychic echo of that final command. Now, you will listen did not fade. It lingered in the architecture of our minds, a permanent resident in the space where our own thoughts were born, and the silence that followed on the bridge was a living, breathing thing, thick with the weight of abject terror. It was the silence of a tomb, the quiet of the grave. Someone behind me retched, the sound unnervingly loud in the sudden stillness. Navigator Chen was weeping without making a sound, tears carving clean paths through the sheen of sweat on her face. Every officer, every technician was frozen, their faces slack with a shared, intimate violation. We had faced the void, solar flares, and the specter of catastrophic system failure. But this was different. This was not a problem to be solved with engineering or protocol. This was a god swatting a fly, and we were the fly. Captain Valerius was the first to break, but it was not a recovery. It was a shattering. The man's entire identity was built on a foundation of command, on the principle that any problem could be solved with sufficient force or capital. That foundation had just been pulverized. Fire, he whispered, his voice a dry rasp. No one moved. He spun around, his eyes wild and bloodshot, grabbing the tactical officer by the collar. Did you hear me? Target the surface main plasma batteries. Fire on that thing. The tactical officer, a young woman named Anya, just stared back at him, her own eyes hollow with shock. She didn't flinch, didn't speak. She was still trapped in the echo of that voice. Valerius threw her aside and lunged for the tactical console himself, his hands shaking as he tried to input the firing commands. The console remained dark. A single line of crimson text pulsed on the screen. Command override ingress denied. He slammed his fist against the unyielding screen again and again, his roars of fury turning into something animal and desperate. The ship was no longer ours. It was a cage, and the bars were our own systems. The presence in our minds began to shift. The initial booming command subsided, replaced by something far more insidious. It was a slow, deliberate exploration, a psychic current that flowed through the ship and through us, with the curiosity of a scientist dissecting a new specimen. It sifted through our memories, not as a violent intrusion, but as a gentle, inexorable tide. I saw flashes of my childhood on the smog-choked spires of Neo-Alexandria, the sting of failure in my final academy simulations, the face of a lover I had left behind. They weren't just memories. They were imbued with a profound, alien sense of sorrow, as if this entity was not just seeing them, but feeling them and judging them wanting. I heard the stifled gasps and murmurs around me and knew the others were experiencing the same thing. The security chief, a hardened veteran named Goran, suddenly cried out, "My daughter," his hand reaching out to an empty space beside him. On the other side of the bridge, a young ensign began to giggle, a high, bubbling sound of pure madness. The ship's AI, the dispassionate voice of the Drifter OS that had been our constant companion, began to speak. But its voice was corrupted, fractured, profit margins falling like starlight. The song is correcting the calculation. It was being overwritten, its logic drowned in the planet's psychic symphony. While Valerius descended into impotent rage and the crew unraveled around me, I forced myself to my own console. If this thing was a signal, it had to have a structure, a source. My mind was a chaotic storm of dredged-up fears and regrets. But beneath it, the cartographer, the scientist, still clung to reason. I rerouted my sensor array, ignoring visual and electromagnetic spectra. I focused on the subsonic frequencies, on the quantum resonance detectors, trying to map the psychic energy itself. The display blossomed with an impossible image. A web of shimmering, interconnected nodes pulsed across the surface of Ethel, a network of unimaginable complexity. It was a brain, a planetary consciousness with continents for lobes and oceans for synaptic fluid, and the thorium crystal formations we had come to mine. They weren't just deposits. They were the ganglia, the central hubs of this vast biological intelligence. Our survey team hadn't landed on a mineral outcrop. They had tried to drive a drill into the prefrontal cortex of a god. The humming in my skull intensified, coalescing around me. The entity seemed to sense my scrutiny, my attempt to comprehend it. A new voice, singular and focused, whispered directly into my mind. A thought aimed just for me. "You map the stone, but you do not understand the heart." I recoiled from the console as if struck. This was no longer a broadcast, it was a conversation. I keyed a response on my datapad, my fingers clumsy. "We didn't know." I typed, the words feeling utterly inadequate. "We meant no harm." The answer was not in words, but in a feeling, a wave of ancient, weary sadness that washed through me. So profound it brought tears to my eyes. It was the grief of a being that had watched stars be born and die, a being that had been alone for eons, and we, in our avarice, had brought it nothing but pain. The ship groaned, a deep, resonant shudder that ran through the entire superstructure. Red lights began to flash across the bridge as systems went critical. "Life support is fluctuating on decks 7 through 12, someone shouted. "Gravity plating is failing in the cargo bay. The reactor core is singing." A terrified engineering tech reported over the comm, her voice cracking. "The containment field is resonating with the planet's frequency. It's not stable." The ship was dying. Or rather, the planet was simply unmaking it. Valerius, his face slick with sweat, seemed to find a new surge of adrenaline. He pulled his sidearm, a heavy-bore pulse pistol, and pointed it at me. "You," he screamed, his voice raw. "You're the geologist. You knew you did this." My heart hammered against my ribs, but the alien sadness in my mind seemed to temper my fear. "No." "Captain," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. "You did. Your greed did. We tried to perform a lobotomy on a living world, and now it's fighting back." "Lies," he shrieked, advancing on me. "It's a hostile X factor. It needs to be neutralized." Before he could take another step, Goran, the security chief, moved with startling speed. Despite his own mental torment, his training took over. He tackled Valerius from the side, a clean, efficient maneuver that sent the pistol skittering across the deck. The two men wrestled on the floor, their struggle a pathetic, microcosmic reflection of our larger, hopeless fight. No one else moved to intervene. We were all trapped in our own private wars. The mental pressure reached a crescendo, and the ship's internal lights flickered and died, plunging us into the red glow of the emergency strobes. In the pulsing darkness, the view screen, which had been showing the serene, beautiful face of Ethel, changed. It was no longer a view. It was a vision. We saw the universe from the planet's perspective. We saw the slow, silent dance of galaxies, the birth of nebulas in explosions of incandescent gas, the patient, inexorable creep of entropy. We felt its loneliness, its vast, silent vigil in the dark. And then we saw ourselves. We saw the Stardust Drifter as a tiny, sharp, painful thing, a needle lancing its ancient flesh, its crew a swarm of noisy, grasping bacteria, blind to the sanctity of the life they were trespassing upon. The vision was a judgment, an indictment, and a sentence all in one. The feeling was not of anger, but of a surgeon's cold necessity. An infection must be cleansed. The lights on the bridge flickered back to a dim, steady hum. The psychic pressure receded, not vanishing, but pulling back to a low, constant thrum, the idle hum of a predator that knows its prey is cornered. Gorn had Valerius pinned, his face a grim mask of duty. The giggling ensign had fallen silent, curled into a fetal position under his console. A semblance of shell-shocked order began to return, but the ship was fundamentally changed. The air was cold, recycled with a faint, ozone-like scent that hadn't been there before. The hum of the engines was gone, replaced by the faint, choral harmony that now seemed to emanate from the very walls of the ship. And then I saw it. On the large, forward viewport that looked out onto the silent, swirling world of Ethel, a frost was forming. It wasn't the uniform haze of condensation. It was a pattern, an intricate, crystalline lattice spreading from the edges of the viewport inward. It grew with a slow, visible, and utterly impossible purpose, branching into delicate, razor-sharp fractals that mirrored the structure of the crystals on the planet below. It was beautiful, mesmerizing, and it was the sound of our doom. I walked towards it, my boots heavy on the deck plating, and reached out a trembling hand. The others watched me, their faces illuminated by the faint, internal light that was beginning to glow from within the growing crystal. The surface was impossibly cold, colder than the vacuum of space itself. As my fingers brushed against it, the whisper returned to my mind, soft and final. The heart of the stone is cold. Soon, you will be too. The crystal was not just on the outside of the viewport. A fine, glittering thread of it was pushing through a microscopic seam in the transparisteel, already beginning to spread on the inside. The planet was no longer just around us. It was in the ship. It was coming for us. And in the etched lines of that impossible, beautiful, and terrifying crystalline flower, I saw the geography of our tomb. The crystalline growth did not stop at the viewport. That was merely the beachhead, the point of first infection. From the seams of the transparisteel, it flowed like a slow-motion liquid, solidifying as it spread. It moved with an unnerving, deliberate intelligence, not as a random mineral formation, but as a living vine seeking nourishment. It traced the power conduits in the ceiling, its facets glinting in the red emergency strobes, a creeping web of silent, geometric beauty. With its advance came the cold, a profound, bone-deep chill that had nothing to do with the ship's failing life support. It was the cold of the planet's heart, a metaphysical winter seeping into our world. The faint, choral hum that now permeated the ship grew in volume, not in our ears, but in the resonant cavities of our skulls, a constant, prayer-like hymn to silence. I pulled my hand back from the viewport, my fingertips numb, and turned to face the wreckage of the command crew. Goran still had Valerius pinned, but the fight had gone out of the captain. He was staring at the advancing crystal, his mouth agape, the raw terror in his eyes having finally burned through his rage. He was a child again, seeing his first true monster. "It's inside," Anya, the tactical officer, whispered. She'd pushed herself up and was now sitting with her back against her console, her face eerily calm. The vacant shock was gone, replaced by a strange, lucid emptiness. "It's in the walls, in the wires. It's tasting the power. It finds it loud." Her words sent a shiver down my spine that had nothing to do with the cold. She wasn't guessing. She was reporting. She had become a reluctant receiver for the planet's broadcast. I made a decision. The bridge was a tomb. It was the ship's brain, and it was being systematically colonized by a greater mind. "We have to move," I said, my voice cutting through the stunned quiet. "We need to get to engineering." Goran looked at me, his face a mask of grim pragmatism. "Why, what's in engineering besides a reactor that's about to go critical? It's the heart of the ship," I explained, gesturing to the crystal crawling along a power conduit above us. "That's what it's following. The flow of energy, the noise. As Anya said, if we can understand how it's interfacing with the core, maybe we can stop it." It was a sliver of a hope, a scientist's desperate gambit. But it was better than waiting here to be frozen into a crystalline statue. Goran seemed to agree. He hauled Valerius to his feet, his grip like iron. "All right, Kalen, you're the expert on alien rocks. Lead the way." "Chen," he barked at the navigator, who was still huddled by her station. "You're with us. The rest of you, get to the central mess hall. Barricade the door. Wait for us. Move." His voice, a familiar bark of command, was enough to break the paralysis for a few. A handful of traumatized officers and technicians scrambled to their feet and fled the bridge, their footsteps echoing in the sudden emptiness. My small, desperate party now consisted of myself, the stoic Goran, the terrified but functional Chen, the broken Captain Valerius, and our unwilling oracle, Anya. We armed ourselves with what we could find: heavy-duty plasma cutters from the emergency locker and a couple of concussive charges. It felt like arming ourselves with sticks against a tidal wave. The journey through the Stardust Drifter was a descent into a waking nightmare. The main corridors were no longer the sterile, white passageways of a corporate vessel. The crystal was everywhere, bursting from ventilation shafts in glittering, razor-sharp bouquets, encasing entire sections of the hallway in translucent, glowing amber. The ship's systems were in open revolt. Gravity plating would fail without warning, sending us stumbling in sudden microgravity before slamming us back to the deck. The automated voice of the ship would flicker to life, not with warnings, but with snippets of the alien song. A beautiful, haunting soprano echoing in the metallic confines. And then there were the others. Not everyone had made it to the mess hall. We found them in the corridors, standing perfectly still, their eyes open and glazed over. The crystal had already found them, not encasing them entirely, but growing from them. Fine filaments sprouting from their fingertips and the corners of their eyes, connecting them to the walls. They had become part of the ship's new crystalline nervous system, their bodies turned into living conduits for the planet's song. They hummed along with it, a low, vacant, and utterly terrifying chorus. Valerius, stumbling between Goran and me, started to whimper. The sight of his crew, of his ship, being so completely and elegantly unmade was too much for his shattered psyche. "Make it stop," he mumbled, over and over. "Just make it stop." "It's not killing them," Anya said, her voice detached as she studied one of the crew members we passed. The man's face was serene, a faint smile on his lips. "It's quieting them, integrating them." The noise of their thoughts was too loud. We were halfway to engineering, moving through a junction near the hydroponics bay, when we ran into the other faction. It seemed not everyone had heeded Goran's order. About a dozen crew members, mostly engineers and security personnel, had formed their own survival party. They were led by the ship's chief engineer, a bulldog of a man named Wren. They were heavily armed with maintenance tools and had barricaded the corridor with plating ripped from the walls. When they saw us, they raised their weapons, plasma torches, and rivet guns. Valerius, seeing a familiar face of authority, seemed to find a spark of his old self. "Wren, thank the stars. These madmen are trying to talk to it. We need to fight. We need to burn it out." Wren nodded grimly, his eyes fixed on me. "The captain's right. We're not going to stand here and let this ice rot our ship. We're going to cut our way to the auxiliary shuttle bay. We're getting out of here." He gestured with his torch to a massive crystalline growth that had completely blocked the corridor behind them. It pulsed with a soft, green light, the choral hum emanating from it almost deafeningly loud. "Don't," I said, stepping forward, my hands raised. "You can't fight it with force. Aggression is a part of the noise it's trying to silence. You'll only make it worse." "It's a rock." Geologist Wren spat. "You burn it. You break it. We're not listening to your Xeno babble." Light it up. He and two of his men activated their plasma torches, the hiss of ignited gas cutting through the air as they advanced on the crystal wall. "No. Wait," I shouted, but it was too late. The moment the superheated plasma touched the crystal's surface, the universe screamed. It wasn't a sound. It was a psychic shock wave that erupted from the crystal, a blast of pure, undiluted agony and fury that slammed into our minds. Everyone, on both sides, collapsed to the deck, clutching their heads. It was 1,000,000 times worse than the initial command we had felt on the bridge. This was the raw, unfiltered pain of the planetary mind. A being that had not felt such a sharp, violent sting in millennia. It was the pain of a surgeon's scalpel being plunged into a living nerve. The crystal wall reacted. It didn't melt or shatter. It exploded outward in a storm of crystalline shards. The two men beside Ren were impaled instantly, their bodies thrown back against the wall, held there by a dozen glittering spikes. Ren himself was luckier, or perhaps unluckier. A single, large shard drove through his shoulder, pinning him to the deck. He screamed, a real, physical sound of pain that was quickly drowned out as the crystal began to grow over him, consuming him. The rest of us could only watch in paralyzed horror. As the psychic shriek subsided, leaving a ringing void in its wake, the consequences of their actions became clear. The crystal growth throughout the corridor accelerated exponentially. It poured from the walls, the floor, the ceiling. No longer a slow, creeping vine, but a surging, unstoppable glacier. It flowed around the screaming, dissolving form of Ren and his men, covering them completely. Then it came for us. "Move now," Goran roared, dragging Chen and the catatonic Valerius back the way we had come. Anya and I scrambled after them. The crackling, hissing sound of the hyper-advancing crystal just meters behind us. We sealed a pressure door just as a crystalline spear punched through the reinforced metal, the tip glittering inches from my face. We were trapped in a side corridor, the main path to engineering, now a solid wall of angry, glowing crystal. The psychic presence returned, no longer sad or curious. Now, it was focused, clinical, and utterly cold. The infection resists. The cleansing must be absolute. The ship groaned around us. The sound of tearing metal and collapsing structures. It wasn't just growing inside the ship anymore. It was actively disassembling it, taking it apart piece by piece, incorporating the raw materials into its own expanding form. "It's over," Chen sobbed, sliding to the floor. "We're going to die." I looked at the schematics on my datapad, my mind racing, desperately seeking a way out. A last, impossible option. The main conduits were blocked, but there was another way to the reactor, a service shaft running from the lower decks directly to the containment chamber. It was a dangerous, cramped path, never meant for personnel, but it was our only choice. Then, a thought struck me. A terrible, desperate piece of logic born from Anya's words and the planet's violent reaction to the plasma torches. It was reacting to our technology, to our aggression, to the noise of our very existence. The ship's reactor core was the loudest, most concentrated source of that noise, a miniature, tamed star burning in its heart. It was the source of the power the crystal was following. It was the ultimate lure. "What if we turned it off, Goran?" I said, my voice low and urgent. "We're not going to engineering to fight it. We're going there to surrender." He looked at me, his face grim. "What are you talking about?" "We're going to shut down the reactor," I said, the words tasting like madness on my tongue. "We're going to kill the ship, all of it. Power, life support, everything. We have to make ourselves silent. Utterly, completely silent. It's the only way it might. Listen." It was the ultimate gamble. We would be trading a slow, crystalline death for a quick, cold one in the dark. But it was also the only course of action that addressed the fundamental problem. We weren't fighting a monster. We were a disease. And this was our only chance to prove we could be cured. Goran stared at me for a long moment, the red emergency light casting deep shadows across his face, making it impossible to read his expression. The idea was insane. A ship without power in deep space was a coffin. Every protocol, every instinct, every bit of training he had ever received screamed that the reactor was sacrosanct. You did not shut down the heart. And yet, he had seen what happened when we fought back. He had felt that psychic scream, a pain so profound it had nearly stopped his own heart. He looked at Chen, sobbing quietly on the floor, at the vacant, broken shell of Captain Valerius, and then at Anya, who was watching me with an unnerving, knowing gaze. Finally, he gave a single, sharp nod. "If we're going to die," he said, his voice a low rumble, "we'll do it on our own terms. Chen, get up. There's no time for that." His pragmatism was a cold, sharp anchor in the swirling chaos of my own fear. Chen, startled by his tone, pushed herself to her feet, wiping her face with a trembling hand. The five of us began our descent. The service shaft was a vertical hell, a cramped, greasy tube of ladders and exposed conduits, meant only for maintenance drones. The ship's groans were louder here, the vibrations running through the rungs of the ladder, a constant reminder of the vessel's agonizing deconstruction. The crystal was here, too. It hadn't advanced as quickly in these forgotten spaces, but it was present, fine, hair-like filaments growing in the gaps between plates, glowing with that same soft and internal light. It was as if the planet's consciousness was sinking its roots deep into every part of the ship, preparing for a final, terrible bloom. With every level we descended, the hum in our minds grew stronger, the choral harmony more complex. It was no longer just a vague presence. It was a layered, intricate symphony of thought, and I began to discern individual motifs within it. There was a current of profound curiosity, a stream of ancient memory, and a deep, resonant bass note of absolute, unyielding purpose. It was building toward something, a final crescendo. The journey was a test of endurance. Valerius was almost dead weight, his mind so shattered that Goran had to practically carry him down the ladders. Chen, though terrified, found a reserve of strength, her movements becoming more sure-footed and determined with each level we passed. It was Anya who was the most unsettling. She moved with a strange, fluid grace, seemingly untroubled by the claustrophobic confines or the imminent threat. She would occasionally reach out and touch one of the crystalline filaments, her head cocked as if listening to a secret conversation. "It's building a new body for itself," she murmured at one point, her voice distant. "Using our ship as the skeleton, it finds our engineering primitive, but efficient." We finally reached the lowest maintenance level, just outside the reactor's primary containment chamber. The air here was thick with the smell of ozone and the palpable thrum of immense power. The chamber door, a meter-thick slab of reinforced alloy, was sealed. A small, armored porthole was set into the door at eye level. I peered through it. The sight within was both terrifying and sublime. The reactor core, a suspended sphere of roiling plasma, still burned brightly. A miniature sun held in place by a web of magnetic containment fields. But the chamber itself was no longer a sterile, metallic space. The crystal was everywhere. It had grown from the walls and floor in immense, cathedral-like spires, arcing towards the core. They didn't touch it. The intense heat and magnetic fields kept them at bay, but they surrounded it. A cage of glittering, expectant silence. They were drinking in the radiation, the raw energy, feeding on it. The choral hum was almost deafening here, the source of the symphony we had been hearing throughout the ship. It was the sound of the planet mind communing with the stolen star in our vessel's heart. "The shutdown controls are on the other side of that door," I said, my voice tight. "There's no way to override it from here." Gorn examined the door's locking mechanism. "I can cut it open. It'll take time." "We don't have time," Anya said softly. She stepped up to the door and placed her palm flat against the cold metal. "It knows we're here. It's waiting to see what we do." As if to punctuate her words, the psychic pressure intensified dramatically. It was no longer a background hum, it was a focused, direct probe, a silent question mark forming in our minds. "You have come to the heart of the noise. What is your purpose?" Before I could even formulate a response, Valerius answered. The captain, who had been a whimpering, semi-catatonic wreck, suddenly straightened up. A strange light entered his eyes, a flicker of his old, arrogant fire, but twisted, corrupted. "Our purpose," he said, his voice a strange, layered chorus of his own and something ancient, something other. "Our purpose is to command, to conquer." He lunged forward, not for the door, but for me. I realized with a jolt of horror that the planet mind had found a willing vessel. Valerius's shattered ego, his desperate need for control, had made him a perfect puppet. He was no longer just a man. He was a mouthpiece for the part of the planet mind that saw us only as a threat. Gorn reacted instantly, tackling Valerius again. But this time the captain fought with an unnatural strength, his eyes glowing with a faint, green light. The two of them crashed against the far wall of the narrow corridor. "Kalen, the door!" Goran roared, struggling to hold the thrashing captain down. Chen and I threw our weight against the manual release valve, our muscles screaming in protest. With a groan of tortured metal, the massive lock began to disengage. As we worked, the planet mind seemed to split its focus. Through the porthole, I could see the crystal spires within the chamber begin to vibrate, the light within them pulsing with an angry, accelerated rhythm. In my mind, the voice of the Valerius thing screamed with rage and entitlement. "You will not silence us. We will take this fire and spread it to the stars. The age of silence is over." But beneath that, another, quieter current of thought flowed into me, the one I had felt before, the ancient, weary, and curious part of the consciousness. Is this all your kind? Is noise violence? Is there no capacity for stillness? The lock finally gave way with a deafening clang, and the heavy door swung inward. The wave of heat and raw power that washed over us was immense. The choral hum was a physical force that vibrated in my teeth. Goran, having finally subdued Valerius with a well-placed blow to the head, shoved the unconscious captain aside. "Go shut it down," he yelled, drawing his pulse pistol and taking up a defensive position at the door. "I'll hold them off." I didn't know who they were, but I didn't wait to find out. I scrambled into the reactor chamber, the catwalks beneath my feet vibrating with power. Anya was right behind me, her movements calm and certain. The main control console was across a narrow bridge that spanned the gap above the containment field. As we ran, the crystal spires reacted to our presence. Crystalline tendrils, as thin as wires, lashed out from the spires, trying to intercept us. They weren't trying to impale us, I realized, but to touch us, to connect us, to integrate us. We dodged and weaved, the air crackling with static discharge where the tendrils brushed against the metal railings. We reached the console, a bank of flickering screens and manual overrides. My hands flew across the controls, initiating the emergency shutdown sequence. It was a complex, multi-stage process designed to prevent accidental meltdown. Alarms blared, their physical sound almost a relief after the psychic noise. I need to vent the primary plasma core before I can disengage the magnetic containment, I shouted to Anya over the roar of the machinery. It's going to take at least 3 minutes. Anya wasn't listening. She was looking up at the roiling sphere of plasma above us, her face filled with a strange, beatific wonder. Such a loud, beautiful heart, she whispered. Then, the voice of the planet spoke in my mind, the two halves of its consciousness seeming to merge into one, a final, unified thought directed at me. You would kill your own heart to bring silence, a gesture of profound and illogical sacrifice. Show us. The chamber door behind us slammed shut, sealing us inside. Goran and Chen were locked out. We were locked in. The crystal spires began to grow with renewed vigor, no longer just reaching for the core, but for the control console, for us. It was a race. As the final seconds of the venting sequence counted down, a massive crystalline arch grew over the console, trapping Anya and me beneath it. The tendrils were everywhere, brushing against my arms, my face. The cold was absolute, my fingers growing numb on the controls. The final override required a physical key turn, a last, archaic safety measure. As I reached for it, a crystalline filament wrapped around my wrist. It didn't hurt. It felt inquisitive. I felt a flood of information, of sensation, the ship's entire schematic, its power flow, its life support systems, all laid bare in my mind, perceived not as data, but as a living anatomy. It was trying to understand, even as it consumed. Almost silent, the voice whispered, a hint of what might have been approval. Almost still, with my last ounce of strength, my flesh already stiffening with the cold, I turned the key. The magnetic containment field collapsed. The sphere of plasma, deprived of its cage, swelled for a single, brilliant instant, and then the Stardust Drifter's heart went out. The chamber was plunged into absolute darkness and absolute silence, the only light coming from the fading, residual glow of the crystal spires. And in that perfect, silent dark, the voice in my head spoke one last time, no longer a chorus or command, but a single, clear, and infinitely curious thought. Stillness. And now, what the darkness that followed the reactor shutdown was a physical entity. It was heavy, absolute, and filled with a silence so profound it seemed to have its own sound. A low thrum that was the absence of all vibration. The only light came from the crystal spires, their internal glow fading like dying embers, casting long, skeletal shadows across the chamber. The cold was instantaneous and brutal, a cryogenic shock that promised a quick, clean death. But I was not dead. The crystalline filament was still wrapped around my wrist, and through it, the planet's final question echoed not as a threat, but as a genuine philosophical inquiry: stillness. And now, what the connection was no longer a broadcast I was passively receiving. It was a link, a direct conduit into the heart of the planet mind. The cold in my arm began to recede, replaced by a strange, neutral energy, and my consciousness expanded. I was no longer just Kalen, senior cartographer, trapped in a dying ship. I was standing in a silent forest of immense crystalline trees under a sky of swirling, unfamiliar stars. I was floating in the cold, black depths of a subterranean ocean where thoughts glowed like bioluminescent creatures. I was feeling the slow, patient, geological time of a consciousness that measured its life in the erosion of mountains. I was experiencing the mind of Ethel. I saw its history not as a narrative, but as a layered sensory experience. I felt its birth in the stellar dust, its long annihilatory eons of quiet contemplation. It was a being of pure, complex pattern. Its thoughts, the elegant mathematics of crystal growth and the slow dance of tectonic plates. It had no concept of voice, of individuals, of the chaotic, fleeting, and unbearably loud static that was biological life as I knew it. When the Stardust Drifter had arrived, it was not seen as a ship or crew, but as a painful, incomprehensible noise, a discordant shriek in a symphony of perfect silence. Our drills, our engines, our panicked thoughts, it was a neurological disease, a fever that had to be quieted. The crystal was not a weapon, it was an antibody, its purpose to absorb, silence, and integrate the chaotic element back into the stillness of the whole. Through our link, I answered its question. I did not use words. I pushed back my own consciousness, my fear, my hope, my illogical, desperate act of self-destruction to achieve peace. I showed it the concept of sacrifice. I showed it the idea of a single, separate consciousness choosing to end its own noise for the sake of another, for a mind that had only ever known the seamless unity of a single planetary self. The idea of an individual acting against its own survival for a principle was a staggering, paradoxical revelation. The filament on my wrist pulsed with a new light, not the cold green of before, but a soft, warm gold. The killing cold in the reactor chamber began to recede, replaced by a neutral, breathable atmosphere. Anya, who had been slumped against the console, stirred, her eyes fluttering open. She looked at my wrist, at the golden light spreading in a delicate, vein-like pattern up my arm, and she smiled faintly. "You listened," she whispered. The massive chamber door, which had sealed us in, did not open. It dissolved. The metal and crystal flowed apart like parting curtains, revealing the corridor beyond. Goran and Chen stood there, their faces etched with fear and astonishment. They had been preparing for the end, for the final, crushing silence of a dead ship. But instead, they saw me, standing in a chamber now filled with a gentle, golden light, a living, breathing part of the alien architecture. Goran raised his pistol on instinct, his eyes locked on the glowing patterns now visible on my skin. "Kalen, what happened?" "It understands," I said, and my voice sounded strange to my own ears, resonant, as if spoken in a choir of one. We were shouting, so it couldn't hear us. I just turned off the noise. The ship began to change. The transformation was no longer hostile. The sharp, aggressive crystal growth softened, its edges rounding, its light shifting from a warning green to the same warm gold that flowed from my arm. It began to rebuild the ship, not as it was, but as something new. Broken conduits were healed with living, crystalline circuits. The dead. Silent crew members we had passed in the corridors began to glow. the filaments connecting them pulsing with a soft, rhythmic light. They were not dead, nor were they alive as we understood it. They were part of the ship's new consciousness, their individual noises silenced, their minds now part of the planet's quiet symphony. It was a fate that chilled me to my core, yet I could feel no pain from them, only a profound, dreamless peace. We walked back to the bridge, a silent, awestruck procession. The journey was a passage through a world being reborn. The ship was healing itself, becoming a hybrid of technology and biology, a techno-organic arc fused with the will of the planet. On the bridge, the main view screen was no longer a window, but a living map of the planet mind's consciousness, a swirling, beautiful galaxy of thoughts. And floating in the center of the bridge was a single, perfect, crystalline cocoon. Inside, Captain Valerius floated in a state of suspended animation, his face peaceful, his noise finally and completely silenced. The planet mind gave me a choice, a final communication transmitted through our link. It was not in words, but in a clear, unambiguous vision. I saw the ship's auxiliary shuttle, untouched by the crystal, being gently pushed out of the hangar bay by glowing tendrils. I saw Goran, Chen, and a handful of other survivors who had barricaded themselves in the mess hall being guided towards it. And then I saw myself, standing on the bridge, the golden patterns covering my entire body, my hand resting on a console that had become a living, crystalline heart. The ship, this new, symbiotic entity, needed a bridge, an interpreter between the loud, chaotic mind of a human and the silent, vast consciousness of a world. Goran looked from the vision in my eyes to the shuttle now appearing on the view screen. He understood. "You're not coming with us." "I can't," I said. "My job was to map this world. I'm just finishing the mission." I looked at him, at this man of pure, simple action who had saved my life. "Tell them what happened here. Tell them the universe isn't for the taking. Tell them to listen." He held my gaze, his hard eyes filled with a new, reluctant understanding. He nodded, a gesture of profound, final respect. "We will." I stood on the bridge of the vessel that was no longer the Stardust Drifter and watched the small shuttle pull away, a tiny spark of noise and life escaping back into the void. Anya remained with me, her hand resting on the central crystal, her face serene. She had found her choir as the shuttle vanished. I placed my own hand beside hers. The ship hummed around us, a new song, not of mourning, but of creation. My consciousness merged with the ship and the planet below, my individual thoughts becoming a single, clear note in a symphony that spanned a world. I was Kalen. I was the ship. I was the cartographer who had finally found a world that could not be mapped with lines and charts, but only with silence, with stillness, and with a willingness to finally, truly, listen. And as we adjusted our orbit, a new and silent guardian in the lonely skies of Ethel, I knew our long journey had just begun.